Miss Marple, and the last tea of Lady Bramley. Welcome, dear listeners. I'm Ailey, your host from Cafe Tales, and I'm so glad you're with us tonight for another cozy mystery. But before we begin, here's a little riddle for you. I'm always in front view, but you can never see me. What am I? Share your guesses in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for new stories every evening. Now make yourself comfortable, pour a cup of tea, and let's step into tonight's mystery. The rain came down in torrents that Thursday afternoon, lashing against the tall windows of Bramley Court with a persistence that seemed almost personal. The ancient cedars on the lawn bent and swayed under the assault, their dark branches reaching toward the gray stone of the house like supplicating arms. Inside the morning room, however, all was warmth and gentle comfort, the sort of atmosphere that Lady Augusta Bramley had cultivated for the better part of 40 years. "How perfectly dreadful the weather has turned," observed Mrs. Clement, settling her ample form more comfortably into one of the chintz-covered chairs that Lady Bramley favored. "I do hope it clears before we must venture home." Lady Bramley, a woman of 73 with steel-gray hair arranged in perfect waves and eyes that missed very little indeed, moved with her customary brisk efficiency about the room. She had always prided herself on doing the honors properly, and her days at home would be no exception, despite it being her last before closing Bramley Court for the season. "Nonsense, my dear," she replied in her crisp, well-modulated voice. "A little rain never hurt anyone. Besides, we shall have our tea presently, and that will set us all to rights." Miss Jane Marple, seated quietly in the corner with her knitting in her lap, smiled gently at this familiar ritual. She had been coming to Lady Bramley's at homes for nearly 15 years now, ever since moving to St. Mary Mead, and she'd grown quite fond of these civilized gatherings. There was something reassuring about their predictability, the way Lady Bramley always positioned herself just so by the silver tea urn, the precise moment when James would announce that tea was served. "I do think it's such a pity you're closing the house, Augusta," said Lady Bantry, adjusting her hat with its rather unfortunate collection of artificial cherries. "The village won't be quite the same without your Thursday afternoons." A shadow crossed Lady Bramley's face, though it was gone so quickly that Miss Marple wondered if she had imagined it. "Well, my dear, one cannot go on forever. The house is becoming rather too much, and Lydia and I shall be quite comfortable in the dower house." Miss Lydia Martin, Lady Bramley's companion, looked up from where she sat beside the window, her pale hands folded in her lap. She was a woman of perhaps 55, with faded blonde hair, and the sort of self-effacing manner that spoke of years spent in genteel dependence. "Lady Augusta is far too generous," she murmured. "I'm sure I don't deserve such kindness." "Nonsense," Lady Bramley said briskly, though Miss Marple detected a slight tightness around her eyes. "We have rubbed along together very well these past 12 years, have we not?" The door opened to admit more guests, and the conversation turned to safer topics. Dr. Haydock arrived, shaking raindrops from his coat and grumbling good-naturedly about the weather. The Reverend Leonard Clement followed, accompanied by his wife Griselda, who immediately began apologizing for being late. "The car simply wouldn't start," she explained breathlessly, "and poor Leonard had to get quite soaked trying to persuade it." Adrian Bramley, Lady Augusta's nephew, emerged from the corner where he had been fiddling with what appeared to be some sort of wireless apparatus. He was a young man of perhaps 30, with a sort of weak chin that suggested a corresponding weakness of character, and an unfortunate habit of running up debts that his aunt was invariably called upon to settle. "I say, Aunt Augusta," he called out cheerfully. "I've nearly got this crystal set working properly, just needs a bit more adjustment to the aerial wire." Lady Bramley's expression suggested that she found her nephew's enthusiasm for wireless communication considerably less charming than he did himself. "Perhaps you might leave your hobbies for later, Adrian. We have guests." Mrs. Brigg, the housekeeper, appeared in the doorway with her usual air of barely controlled efficiency. She was a formidable woman of middle years, with iron-gray hair pulled back severely, and the sort of penetrating stare that could reduce housemaids to tears at 20 paces. "Will you be wanting tea served now, my lady?" "Yes, thank you, Mrs. Brigg. The usual arrangement, if you please." Miss Marple watched with interest as the familiar ritual began. Mrs. Brigg directed James, the butler, in the careful positioning of the silver tea service on its accustomed table by the window. The centerpiece was a magnificent antique electric urn, its silver surface gleaming despite its age, mounted on a small hot plate that Lady Bramley had had specially fitted some years ago. "Such a lovely piece," commented Mrs. Clement admiringly. "Is it very old?" "Georgian," Lady Bramley replied with evident satisfaction. "It belonged to my grandmother. I had it converted to electricity when we first had the house wired. Oh, 20 years ago now. So much more convenient than the old spirit lamp arrangement." James, a dignified man of 60-odd years who had been with the family since before the war, moved with practiced efficiency. He positioned the urn precisely, arranged the delicate china cups and saucers, and checked that the small hot plate was properly connected to its cord. Miss Marple noted, with the sort of attention to detail that had served her well in the past, that he plugged the flex into the corner socket with particular care. "Tea is served, my lady," he announced with the gravity that the ritual demanded, and then withdrew to a discreet distance. The last guest to arrive was Inspector Slack from the local police, who appeared somewhat embarrassed to find himself in such refined company. He clutched a manila envelope under one arm and shifted uncomfortably from foot to foot. "Begging your pardon, my lady," he said awkwardly. "Just some forms that need your signature when convenient. Nothing urgent." "Of course, Inspector. Perhaps after tea." Mr. Simmons, Lady Bramley's elderly solicitor, cleared his throat delicately. "I'm afraid I also have a small matter of business, Augusta. Just a paper that requires your attention." "Nothing. That cannot wait until we've had our tea, naturally." Lady Bramley nodded graciously, though Miss Marple thought she detected a slight stiffening of her shoulders. "Well, then, shall we proceed? I do so believe in punctuality when it comes to tea." She moved to her accustomed position by the urn, her right hand reaching for the silver tap with the unconscious precision of long habit. The conversation continued to flow around the room, a pleasant murmur of voices discussing the weather, the village fete, the deplorable state of the roads since the recent rains. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she worked on what appeared to be a baby's booty, her mild blue eyes taking in the familiar scene. There was something particularly English about these moments, she reflected, something that spoke of continuity and tradition, of a world where certain things could be depended upon to remain constant. The rain continued to beat against the windows, and the fire crackled cheerfully in the grate. Lady Bramley stood poised by her silver urn, every inch the gracious hostess, while her guests settled themselves expectantly for what had always been, in Miss Marple's experience, a most pleasant and civilized hour. It was exactly 4 by the mantelpiece clock, when Lady Bramley turned the silver tap for what would prove to be the very last time. The gentle clink of china cups and saucers provided a soothing counterpoint to the persistent drumming of rain against the windows. Lady Bramley's guests had settled into the comfortable rhythm of afternoon tea, that most civilized of English customs, where conversation flowed as smoothly as the tea from the silver urn. "I do hope young Timothy recovers quickly from his cold," Mrs. Clement was saying to Griselda, who had been explaining her eldest son's absence from choir practice. "These autumn chills can be so persistent." Miss Marple's needles continued their steady clicking as she observed the pleasant domestic scene. Dr. Haydock had cornered the Reverend Clement near the bookshelf, no doubt discussing some parish matter, while Lady Bantry examined the watercolors that hung above the piano. Adrian Bramley had reluctantly abandoned his wireless apparatus and was making what appeared to be heavy weather of polite conversation with Mr. Simmons. "I must say the roses in your garden were particularly lovely this year, Augusta," Lady Bantry remarked, turning from her inspection of a rather mediocre landscape. "That new climbing variety by the south wall was quite spectacular in July." Lady Bramley smiled with genuine pleasure. "The Madame Alfred Carrière, you mean?" "Yes, I was rather pleased with how well it took. Of course I shall miss seeing it next year." "Surely you'll visit from the Dower House," suggested Griselda. "It's not as though you're moving to the other end of the county." "Perhaps," Lady Bramley replied, though her tone suggested she found the prospect less than appealing. "One cannot predict what the future may hold." Miss Lydia Martin, who had been sitting quietly by the window with her hands folded in her lap, stirred slightly at these words. Her pale blue eyes fixed themselves upon her employer, with an expression that Miss Marple found rather difficult to interpret. There was something there, anxiety perhaps, or was it something stronger? Inspector Slack shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly feeling out of place among the genteel conversation. He clutched his manila envelope rather tighter and cast longing glances toward the door, as though calculating the earliest moment at which politeness would permit his escape. James, the butler, had positioned himself at a discreet distance near the door, ready to assist should his services be required, while Mrs. Brigg could be glimpsed through the partly open door to the hall, no doubt ensuring that the domestic machinery continued to run smoothly. Lady Bramley moved with her characteristic briskness to take up her position by the silver urn. She had performed this same ritual countless times over the years, and her movements had the unconscious precision of long practice. Her right hand reached for the ornate silver tap, while her left sought the familiar support of the radiator valve beside the hearth. "Do help yourselves, my dears," she began, her voice carrying the warmth of genuine hospitality. The words were never completed. As her fingers closed around the silver tap, there was a sudden sharp sound, rather like fat spitting in a hot pan, as Miss Marple would later describe it. Lady Bramley stiffened abruptly, her body going rigid for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. "Oh!" she cried out, a short, sharp exclamation that cut through the gentle murmur of conversation like a knife. Her left hand, seeking the radiator valve for balance, scrabbled desperately at the painted metal surface. For a heartbeat she swayed on her feet, and then her knees buckled. She fell heavily, striking the brass fender with a sound that would haunt Miss Marple's dreams for weeks to come. The effect on the assembled company was immediate and dramatic. Griselda Clement screamed, a high piercing sound that seemed to galvanize everyone into action. "Stand back, please," Dr. Haydock commanded with the authority of his profession. "Give her air." Lady Bantry had gone quite pale and was fumbling in her handbag for her smelling salts. Mrs. Clement was making distressed clucking noises, while her husband moved to comfort his wife, who was now sobbing quietly into a handkerchief. Adrian Bramley stood frozen for a moment, his face a picture of shock and confusion before rushing forward. "Aunt Augusta, what happened? Is she—" James appeared as if from nowhere, his usual composure cracking slightly as he knelt beside his fallen mistress. Mrs. Brigg materialized in the doorway, her sharp features set in lines of grim concern. "Shall I telephone for an ambulance, sir?" she asked. Dr. Haydock, who was now crouched beside Lady Bramley, his experienced hands moving quickly as he examined her, shook his head. Miss Marple had set aside her knitting and risen to her feet, but she made no move to join the crowd around the fallen woman. Instead, her keen eyes were taking in details that others in their shock and concern might overlook. The position of Lady Bramley's hands, the exact spot where she had fallen, the way the light caught the silver surface of the tea urn. Dr. Haydock worked in grim silence for several minutes, checking pulse, breathing, pupils. His face grew increasingly grave as the examination continued. Finally, he sat back on his heels with a deep sigh. "I'm afraid it's too late," he said quietly. "Lady Bramley is dead." The words fell into a silence so complete that the ticking of the mantelpiece clock seemed thunderous. Griselda's sobs redoubled, and even Inspector Slack looked shaken. "But how?" Adrian demanded, his voice cracking slightly. "She was perfectly, well, just a moment ago." "Most likely heart," Dr. Haydock replied, though his tone suggested he was not entirely convinced by his own words. "At her age, these things can happen very suddenly." "But surely there must have been some warning," protested Mr. Simmons, who'd gone quite gray around the edges. "Some indication of distress." Miss Marple approached quietly, her mild blue eyes focused not on the tragic figure of Lady Bramley, but on the doctor's grave face. "Doctor," she said gently, "might I ask what you observe about her hands?" Dr. Haydock glanced up, surprised by the question, then looked again at the still form before him. He lifted Lady Bramley's right hand with careful precision, examining the palm in the afternoon light that filtered through the rain-streaked windows. "Good heavens," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "There's a mark here, a small burn by the look of it." He indicated a tiny black mark on the palm, positioned precisely where the thumb and forefinger met. It was no larger than a pinhead, but unmistakably present. Moving with sudden urgency, Dr. Haydock turned his attention to the silver urn. The ornate tap gleamed in the soft light, but as he examined it more closely, his expression grew increasingly troubled. "Look here," he said, pointing to the tap's surface. "There's a small crater in the metal, fresh by the appearance of it." Inspector Slack, suddenly remembering his professional duties, moved forward with renewed purpose. "Nobody touch anything," he commanded, rather too late to be entirely effective. "This may be a case for investigation." "Poison," whispered Mrs. Clement, her eyes wide with horror. "Someone's poisoned the tea." But Dr. Haydock was shaking his head slowly. "No, I don't believe it was poison. There's no odor, no sign of the usual distress one sees with toxic substances, no trace of bitter almonds that would suggest cyanide." He paused, his gaze moving from the small burn on Lady Bramley's palm to the pitted surface of the silver tap, and then to the electrical cord that snaked across the carpet to the corner socket. "I believe," he said slowly, his voice heavy with the weight of professional certainty, "that Lady Bramley has been electrocuted." The word fell into the room like a stone into still water, sending ripples of shock and disbelief through the assembled company. Miss Marple, still standing quietly beside the tragic scene, felt a familiar stirring of interest despite her genuine sorrow for the death of an old acquaintance. In her long experience, electricity, like poison, rarely killed by accident in circumstances such as these. And if that were indeed the case, then someone in this very room had committed murder most foul. The rain continued to lash against the windows, but inside the morning room of Bramley Court, the cozy warmth of English afternoon tea had given way to something far more sinister indeed. The word electrocuted seemed to hang in the air of the morning room like an unwelcome guest, casting a pall over what had begun as such a civilized gathering. Miss Marple observed how differently people reacted to the shocking news. Griselda Clement had ceased her sobbing, and now sat bolt upright, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and fascination. Lady Bantry appeared to be calculating the swiftest route to the door, while Mr. Simmons clutched his briefcase as though it might provide some protection against the suddenly malevolent atmosphere. Inspector Slack, meanwhile, seemed to be undergoing a transformation from reluctant social visitor to professional investigator. He straightened his shoulders and assumed an expression of official gravity that would have been almost comical under other circumstances. "Now then," he said with newfound authority, "nobody is to leave this room until I've had a chance to examine the scene properly. James, see that all the doors are secured." Miss Marple, who had remained quietly observant throughout the immediate crisis, now stepped forward with a gentle diffidence that those who knew her had learned to respect. "Inspector Slack," she said in her mild voice, "might I suggest that you examine the electrical plug? I believe it may prove quite illuminating." Slack looked as though he might dismiss the suggestion out of hand, but Dr. Haydock nodded approvingly. "Quite right, Miss Marple. If there's been some electrical fault, the plug would be the logical place to begin." James, who had been hovering uncertainly near his fallen mistress, moved with obvious reluctance to disconnect the flex from its socket. His hands, Miss Marple noticed, trembled slightly as he performed this simple task. "Here you are, sir," he said, offering the plug to Inspector Slack with evident distaste. Miss Marple moved closer as Slack examined the black bakelite fitting. Even from her position several feet away, she could detect an unusual odor emanating from the plug. Not the clean smell of good electrical equipment, she noted, but something altogether more troubling. "May I?" she asked politely, extending her hand. Slack hesitated for a moment, then passed the plug to her with obvious reluctance. Miss Marple held it delicately, as one might handle a piece of potentially dangerous evidence, and inhaled carefully. "How? Very interesting," she murmured. "James, when did you last use this particular urn?" The butler looked confused. "Why, this morning, miss, for the servants' tea at 2:45. Then I moved it here for her ladyship's at home." "And did you notice anything unusual about it then?" James frowned, clearly struggling to recall the details of what had seemed at the time a perfectly routine task. "Well, now that you mention it, miss, there was a bit of trouble with the fuse in the pantry. Popped, it did, just as I was setting up for servants' tea." Miss Marple's interest sharpened perceptibly. "Indeed, and what did you do about that?" "Well, miss, I had to move the whole arrangement to the morning room and use the socket in here instead. Mr. Adrian helped me sort out the plug. Very handy with electrical matters is Mr. Adrian. Adrian Bramley, who had been standing silent and pale near the window, started visibly at the mention of his name. "I say that's right. Always happy to help with that sort of thing. Popping. Fuses are a regular nuisance in these old houses." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, then turned her attention to the socket from which the plug had been removed. The cream-colored faceplate showed definite signs of recent disturbance. Tiny scratches around the screw heads that caught the light, and a faint whitening of the paint that suggested the screws had been removed and replaced quite recently. "Brig," she called softly to the housekeeper, who stood rigid in the doorway like a sentinel. "Might I have a word?" The formidable woman approached with obvious reluctance, her sharp features set in lines of disapproval. "Yes, miss. I wonder if any of your staff mentioned anything unusual about the tea urn this afternoon, perhaps during the servants' tea." Mrs. Briggs' eyes narrowed slightly. "Well, since you asked, that silly girl Mary did come running to me, with some nonsense about the urn giving her a tingle when she brushed against it. Stuff and nonsense, I told her. These young girls today always imagining things. A tingle. Dr. Haydock looked up sharply from where he was making notes in a small leather-bound book. That could be significant. A slight electrical leak, perhaps. Miss Marple had moved to examine the tea table more closely. The lace runner beneath where the urn had stood was damp in a wide oval pattern, and the oak surface below showed the faintest of watermarks. "How curious," she murmured, running her finger lightly along the edge of the dampness. "James, was this runner wet when you arranged the tea service?" The butler shook his head emphatically. "Oh no, miss. I always check that everything is perfectly dry before setting out the china. Mrs. Brigg is most particular about such things." "Then someone spilled something here," Miss Marple observed, "and wiped it up afterwards, though not quite thoroughly enough." Inspector Slack had been listening to these exchanges with growing interest, and now he approached the table himself. "Poison?" he asked. "Do you think someone might have tried to poison the tea first, then cleaned up the evidence when it didn't work?" But Miss Marple shook her head gently. "I think not, Inspector. If someone had intended to poison Lady Bramley, they would hardly have gone to the trouble of electrocuting her as well. No, I suspect the dampness serves quite a different purpose." She knelt beside the table, her keen eyes examining the pattern of moisture on the lace runner. "You see how it spreads in such a regular fashion, almost as though it were deliberately applied." Mrs. Clement, who had been following these proceedings with a horrified fascination of someone watching a particularly gruesome play, suddenly spoke up. "But surely, Miss Marple, you're not suggesting that someone deliberately murdered poor Augusta? I mean, who would do such a thing? And why?" It was a question that hung heavily in the air, and Miss Marple noticed how several pairs of eyes turned instinctively toward Lydia Martin, who had remained silent throughout the entire proceedings. The pale companion sat rigidly in her chair, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles showed white. "I think," said Miss Marple quietly, "that we should perhaps consider who might benefit from Lady Bramley's death. Mr. Simmons, I believe you mentioned having some business with Lady Bramley this afternoon." The elderly solicitor shifted uncomfortably. "Well, yes, but it was hardly. That is to say, it was merely a minor adjustment to her will. Nothing of any great significance." "What sort of adjustment?" Inspector Slack demanded with his usual lack of subtlety. Mr. Simmons glanced nervously around the room. "It concerned Miss Martin's annuity. Lady Bramley had been reconsidering the terms. You understand? The document I brought would have, well, it would have reduced the amount considerably." Miss Lydia Martin went, if possible, even paler than before. "Lady Augusta would never have been so unkind," she whispered. "She promised me that I would always be provided for." Nevertheless, Mr. Simmons continued reluctantly, she felt that the current arrangement was perhaps too generous. The new annuity would have been more modest. Miss Marple absorbed this information with apparent calm, though her mind was already beginning to work on the implications. A reduced annuity would certainly provide a motive for murder, though whether Miss Martin possessed the knowledge and opportunity to carry out such an elaborate scheme remained to be seen. Adrian Bramley, meanwhile, had been growing increasingly agitated. "Look here," he burst out. "This is all perfectly beastly. Poor Aunt Augusta is lying there dead, and you're all standing about discussing money and annuities as though she were nothing more than a bank account." Dr. Haydock looked up from his examination of the body. "The young man has a point. Perhaps we should consider the practical arrangements. The police will need to be formally notified, and there will be an inquest naturally." Inspector Slack nodded importantly. "Quite right. Doctor, I'll need to secure the scene and take statements from everyone present. Nobody leaves until I say so." As the various officials began to organize themselves around the grim business of sudden death, Miss Marple continued her quiet examination of the room. The smell from the bakelite plug lingered in her nostrils, not pleasant, but informative. Combined with the fresh scratches on the socket faceplate and the mysteriously damp lace runner, a picture was beginning to emerge in her mind. It was not a picture that involved poison, despite Mrs. Clement's dramatic suggestions. This was something far more subtle, and in its way, far more clever. Someone had turned Lady Bramley's own predictable habits against her, transforming a symbol of domestic comfort into an instrument of death. The question that remained was, who among this gathering of seemingly respectable people possessed both the knowledge and the cold-blooded determination necessary to commit such a crime? The morning room at Bramley Court had taken on an atmosphere quite different from the cozy domesticity that had characterized it an hour earlier. What had been a scene of genteel afternoon tea had transformed into something resembling a stage set for a particularly grim drama. With Lady Bramley's still form as its tragic centerpiece, Miss Marple had withdrawn to her corner chair, ostensibly to resume her knitting, but her sharp eyes continued to observe every detail of the proceedings. She had learned long ago that people revealed as much by their silences as by their words, and the various reactions to Lady Bramley's shocking death were proving most illuminating indeed. Inspector Slack was attempting to establish some sort of official procedure, though it was clear that sudden death by electrocution was somewhat outside his usual experience of poaching cases and minor theft. He had stationed himself importantly near the tea table, notebook in hand, and was regarding the assembled company with a stern expression of authority. "Now then," he announced, "I need to understand exactly what happened here this afternoon. James, you said something about moving the urn from the pantry." The butler straightened his shoulders, clearly grateful to have something concrete to focus upon. "Yes, sir. We always serve the servants' tea first at 2:45 sharp. I had the urn set up in the pantry for that purpose, but just as I was about to plug it in, the fuse went pop." "Pop?" Slack made a note. "What sort of pop?" "Well, sir, the sort of sound a fuse makes when it blows. Quite sudden it was. Left us without power in the pantry, and the servants were already gathering for their tea." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. "How very inconvenient for you, James. What did you do then?" "Well, miss, I couldn't very well leave the staff without their tea. So I moved the whole arrangement to the morning room where we have the corner socket that her ladyship had installed for the purpose." "And the plug?" Dr. Haydock inquired. "Did you notice anything unusual about it when you made the transfer?" James frowned thoughtfully. "Well, sir, that's where Mr. Adrian came to my assistance. The plug seemed to be giving a bit of trouble, and he very kindly offered to sort it out." Adrian Bramley, who had been standing near the window with the expression of a man who wished himself anywhere else, turned with obvious reluctance. "That's right. These old houses, you know, the wiring can be frightfully temperamental. I've made rather a study of electrical matters, actually. Wireless sets and that sort of thing." "Very helpful of you," Miss Marple observed mildly. "And what exactly did you do to the plug?" "Oh, just the usual sort of thing. Rewired it properly, you know. Sometimes the connections work loose, especially in older plugs. Nothing particularly complicated about it." Inspector Slack was scribbling furiously in his notebook. "So you're saying you actually handled the plug that killed Lady Bramley?" The young man went rather pale. "Well, yes, but that was hours ago. And it was working perfectly well for the servants' tea, wasn't it, James?" The butler nodded emphatically. "Oh, yes, sir, no trouble at all. The urn heated beautifully, and the staff had their tea without any difficulty whatsoever." Miss Marple's needles clicked thoughtfully. "James, you mentioned that the pantry fuse has given trouble before." "Oh, my word, yes, miss. Always popping. It is quite a nuisance, really. Mr. Adrian has been very good about helping us with it on previous occasions. How often would you say it happens? James considered this carefully. Well, miss, I should say at least once a fortnight, sometimes more often, particularly when Cook is using the electric ring for the staff meals. This information seemed to interest Miss Marple considerably. And when it happens, do you always move the tea service to this room? Not always, miss. Sometimes Mr. Adrian can sort out the fuse quickly enough, but today he said it would take longer to fix properly, so we made the temporary arrangement here. From across the room, Mr. Simmons cleared his throat nervously. I hope you don't mind my mentioning it, but there was rather an urgency about having tea served promptly today. I had explained to Lady Bramley that I needed her signature on a document, and she was quite particular that it should be done after tea, not before. Miss Lydia Martin, who had remained silent throughout most of these proceedings, suddenly spoke up. What sort of document, Mr. Simmons? Lady Augusta didn't mention any business matters to me. The elderly solicitor looked uncomfortable. Well, my dear, it concerned your circumstances, actually. Lady Bramley felt that perhaps some adjustments might be in order regarding your annuity arrangements. Adjustments? Lydia's voice was barely above a whisper. The current provision is really quite generous, Mr. Simmons explained gently. Lady Bramley had begun to feel that a more modest arrangement might be more appropriate. The document I brought would have reduced your annual income by approximately half. The silence that followed this revelation was profound. Miss Marple observed that several people in the room avoided looking directly at Miss Martin, who had gone quite white and was gripping the arms of her chair with obvious distress. But surely, Lydia managed to say, Lady Augusta would have discussed such a matter with me first. We have always been so frank with one another about household arrangements. Mrs. Brigg, who had been standing like a statue near the door, snorted softly. Her ladyship was always one for making her own decisions in her own time, not one to consult about domestic matters, if you'll forgive me saying so. When would this new arrangement have taken effect? Dr. Haydock asked with professional curiosity. Immediately upon signing, Mr. Simmons replied. Lady Bramley was quite definite about that. She felt it was better to make such changes cleanly, rather than prolonging any awkwardness. Miss Marple found this information most interesting indeed. A sudden reduction in income could certainly provide a powerful motive for desperate action, particularly for someone in Miss Martin's dependent position. Yet something about the pale woman's reaction struck her as genuine, rather than calculated. Adrienne Bramley had been growing increasingly agitated during this discussion. Look here, he burst out. This is all perfectly beastly. You're making it sound as though poor Lydia had some reason to want Aunt Augusta dead. That's absolutely ridiculous. Is it? Inspector Slack asked bluntly. Seems to me that losing half your income might be quite a good reason for wanting someone dead, especially if you knew how to fiddle about with electrical plugs. But I don't know anything about electrical matters, Lydia protested. I can barely manage to change a light bulb without assistance. Yet someone certainly knew enough to create this situation, Miss Marple observed quietly. The question is, who possessed both the knowledge and the opportunity to make the necessary arrangements? She looked thoughtfully around the room, her mild blue eyes taking in each face in turn. Adrian with his professed expertise in wireless matters, James with his practical knowledge of the household's electrical quirks, even Mrs. Brigg, with her formidable competence in all domestic matters. I think, she continued gently, that we need to understand exactly what modifications were made to that plug and when they were made, because unless I am very much mistaken, Lady Bramley's death was not the result of any accidental electrical fault. The rain continued to beat against the windows, and the afternoon light was beginning to fade. But inside the morning room, the atmosphere had grown charged with something far more dangerous than electricity. Chapter 5. The Cut Earth. The atmosphere in the morning room had grown increasingly oppressive as the afternoon wore on, and Miss Marple found herself thinking that a breath of fresh air might prove beneficial to all concerned. However, Inspector Slack's prohibition against anyone leaving the room remained firmly in place, and so she contented herself with suggesting that perhaps a more thorough examination of the electrical arrangements might prove illuminating. If I might make a suggestion, Inspector, it would be most helpful to understand exactly how the tea urn was connected when it was used for the servants' tea. Perhaps we might examine the pantry socket. Slack looked uncertain. Well, I suppose there's no harm in having a look, but I don't want anyone tampering with evidence. Naturally not, Miss Marple agreed. Perhaps Dr. Haydock might accompany us. His medical knowledge of electrical effects could prove most valuable. The small procession that made its way to the pantry consisted of Miss Marple, Inspector Slack, Dr. Haydock, and James the butler, who was needed to explain the domestic arrangements. Mrs. Brigg followed at a discreet distance, her sharp eyes missing nothing. The pantry was a testament to the efficient organization that characterized Bramley Court under Mrs. Brigg's supervision. Shelves lined with gleaming china and carefully labeled preserves, and in one corner, the socket where the urn had been positioned for the servants' meal. Now then, James, Dr. Haydock said, show exactly how you had the urn arranged. The butler indicated a small table beside the socket. Right here, sir, just as it always is for the staff tea. I had everything set up perfectly when the fuse went pop. Miss Marple examined the socket with interest, then turned her attention to an electric kettle that sat nearby on a shelf. Might I ask about this kettle, Mrs. Brigg? Is it used regularly? The housekeeper nodded curtly. Every day, miss. For making tea in the kitchen when the urn isn't required, and it works perfectly well. Oh, yes, miss. Never given a moment's trouble. Miss Marple lifted the kettle carefully, examining its cloth-covered flecks with the sort of attention she might normally reserve for a particularly intricate piece of needlework. The cord showed signs of age and wear, with the fabric covering somewhat frayed near the plug end. How interesting, she murmured, tracing the wire with her finger. Dr. Haydock, might you look at this earth connection? The doctor examined the kettle's plug, which Mrs. Brigg obligingly disconnected for them. Perfectly sound, he pronounced. The earth wire runs properly from the kettle body to the plug. Standard safety measure in any properly wired appliance. And yet, Miss Marple observed, turning her attention back to the urn's plug, which Inspector Slack had brought from the morning room. This plug tells quite a different story. She held the bakelight fitting up to the light filtering through the pantry window. Even to the untrained eye, certain irregularities were immediately apparent. You see here, she pointed out, where the wires enter the plug. The earth wire has been cut quite cleanly and folded back, not frayed or worn, but deliberately severed. Dr. Haydock leaned closer, his expression growing grave. Good heavens, you're quite right. And look here. The live and neutral wires have been reversed and tied with what appears to be black thread. Inspector Slack was scribbling furiously in his notebook. What does that mean exactly? It means, Dr. Haydock explained slowly, that the safety earth connection has been deliberately disabled and the polarity of the current has been reversed. In layman's terms, someone has turned this tea urn into a potential death trap. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. And this small piece of wire here. Would I be correct in thinking this is not the original fuse wire? Mrs. Brigg, who had been following the technical discussion with obvious difficulty, suddenly spoke up. "Oh, that's 15-amp wire, that is. I can tell because I bought some myself just this morning." This revelation produced a moment of stunned silence. "You bought fuse wire this morning?" Inspector Slack demanded. "What for?" Mrs. Brigg drew herself up with wounded dignity. "For the very problem we've been having with that pantry fuse, of course. Always popping it is. And I thought a heavier wire might solve the difficulty once and for all." "But Mrs. Brigg," Dr. Haydick said gently, "you do realize that using 15-amp wire in a 5-amp circuit is extremely dangerous. It prevents the fuse from blowing when it should, which means the circuit can carry far more current than it was designed to handle." The housekeeper looked confused and rather defensive. "Well, I'm sure I don't know about such technical matters. I only know that the constant fuse changing was becoming a terrible nuisance." Miss Marple found this explanation both entirely believable and deeply troubling. Mrs. Brigg's practical approach to household problems had unwittingly created exactly the conditions needed for the electrical trap that had killed Lady Bramley. "Who else would have known about your purchase of the heavier fuse wire?" she asked gently. "Well, I mentioned it to James naturally, and I believe Mr. Adrian was in the kitchen when it arrived from Wren's. He seemed quite interested, actually. Said something about it being useful for his wireless experiments." "Inspector." Slack was looking increasingly bewildered by the technical aspects of the case, but he pressed on gamely. "So you're saying that someone deliberately sabotaged this plug, knowing that Mrs. Brigg had installed heavier fuse wire?" "It would appear so," Miss Marple replied, "though I suspect the sabotage was done after Mrs. Brigg's well-intentioned modification to the fuse box." Dr. Haydick had been examining the modified plug more closely. "The workmanship is quite neat. Actually, whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. The earth wire has been cut with a sharp blade, not torn or twisted off, and the thread used to tie the reversed wires is good quality black cotton thread." Miss Marple's interest sharpened considerably. "Might I see?" She examined the small knots that secured the illegally reversed wires. "How very interesting. These are left-handed knots, I believe. Not many people tie knots in that particular way." "Is that significant?" Slack asked. "It could be very significant indeed," Miss Marple replied. "It suggests that whoever modified this plug was left-handed, or at least accustomed to working with their left hand." She looked thoughtfully around the small group. James was clearly right-handed. She had observed him writing and handling objects throughout the afternoon. Mrs. Brigg likewise showed no signs of favoring her left hand. That left the question of who among their suspects might possess this particular characteristic. "James," she said quietly, "when Mr. Adrian helped you with the plug this afternoon, did you observe how he worked? Which hand did he favor?" The butler considered this carefully. "Well, miss, now that you mention it, I did notice that he seemed to use both hands quite readily. Very dexterous he is with those wireless components of his." As they prepared to return to the morning room, Miss Marple found herself pondering the growing complexity of the case. Someone had certainly possessed the technical knowledge to create an electrical death trap, but the question of motive remained paramount. The revelation about Miss Martin's reduced annuity provided one possible explanation, but Miss Marple's long experience had taught her that the most obvious suspect was not always the guilty party. Moreover, the careful preparation required for such a crime suggested someone with considerable forethought and determination. This had not been a crime of passion, but a calculated act of murder disguised as accident. The rain continued to drum against the windows as they made their way back to the morning room, where the remaining guests waited with varying degrees of patience and anxiety. Miss Marple reflected that before this gray afternoon was over, one of those seemingly respectable people would be revealed as a cold-blooded killer. Upon their return to the morning room, Miss Marple found herself studying the scene with fresh eyes. Informed now by the disturbing discoveries they had made in the pantry, the technical evidence was beginning to paint a picture of deliberate and calculated murder. But there remained the question of exactly how the trap had been set and sprung. The Yalke tea table stood as it had been left, with the silver urn still in its position of honor, though now disconnected and somehow sinister in its silence. Miss Marple approached it with the careful attention of someone examining a particularly complex piece of embroidery, noting details that others might overlook. "Inspector Slack," she said quietly, "might I direct your attention to this lace runner? I believe it may tell us a great deal about what happened here this afternoon." The inspector, who had been consulting his notebook with the air of a man somewhat out of his depth, looked up with relief at having something concrete to examine. "What about it, Miss Marple?" "Well, you see, it's damp. Not just slightly moist, but quite thoroughly wetted in a very particular pattern." She traced the oval shape with her finger, careful not to disturb any evidence. "And yet James assured us that everything was perfectly dry when he arranged the tea service." Dr. Haydock joined them at the table, his medical training lending itself well to the careful observation of physical evidence. "You're quite right. The dampness follows a very regular pattern, almost as though it were deliberately applied." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And notice, if you will, how the silver feet of the urn rest precisely within this damp area. The moisture would create an excellent conductor between the urn and the silver gallery tray beneath." "A conductor?" Inspector Slack looked puzzled. "What would that accomplish?" "Electricity always seeks the easiest path to Earth," Dr. Haydock explained. "If the urn itself had become electrified due to the sabotaged earthing, then any moisture beneath it would help conduct that current to whatever it touched." Miss Marple was examining the radiator valve near where Lady Bramley had fallen. "And this radiator valve would be earth to the water pipes, would it not? If someone were to touch both the electrified urn tap and this valve simultaneously," Dr. Haydock finished grimly, "the current would flow through them, a most effective way to ensure a fatal shock." The implication hung heavily in the air. Someone had not merely sabotaged the electrical connection of the urn, but had carefully prepared the entire scene to ensure that Lady Bramley's habitual movements would complete a deadly circuit. Miss Marple bent closer to examine the lace runner, her keen eyes noting details that spoke of careful preparation. "There's something else here," she murmured. "A small brown mark, rather like a scorch, about the size of a sixpence." Inspector Slack peered at the indicated spot. "Burn mark, you think?" "I suspect so. The sort of mark that might be left by an electrical arc." She straightened, her expression thoughtful. "And notice how the runner sits on the table. It's not quite where it was originally placed." "How can you tell?" Dr. Haydock asked with professional curiosity. Miss Marple pointed to the oak surface beneath. "You see this lighter mark in the wood? It shows where the runner normally rests, but it's been shifted slightly, perhaps 3 inches toward the radiator. After the incident, this observation sent a chill through the small group. It suggested that someone had remained sufficiently composed after Lady Bramley's death to make subtle adjustments to the evidence. "But who would have had the opportunity?" Inspector Slack demanded. "We were all here when it happened." Miss Marple considered this carefully. There was a great deal of confusion immediately after Lady Bramley fell. People were moving about, trying to help, fetching smelling salts. In such circumstances, a small adjustment to a table runner might easily go unnoticed. She moved to the silver tap itself, examining it with the sort of careful attention she might give to a particularly intricate stitch. "Dr. Haydock, might you look at this tap again? I believe you'll find it quite illuminating." The doctor examined the ornate silver fitting with his magnifying glass. "There's definitely pitting here. Small craters in the metal where electrical arcing has occurred. And this deposit." He rubbed gently at a dark smear on the tap surface. "This won't polish out. It's been burned into the metal itself." Miss Marple nodded with satisfaction. "Physical evidence of the electrical discharge, combined with the burn mark on poor Lady Bramley's palm. It tells a very clear story of what happened." Inspector Slack was scribbling notes furiously, though his expression suggested he was struggling to keep up with the technical implications. "So you're saying someone deliberately set up this electrical trap, knowing exactly how Lady Bramley would position herself?" "That would appear to be the case," Miss Marple replied gently. "Someone who knew her habits intimately, the way she always stood just so by the urn, her right hand on the tap, her left seeking the radiator valve for balance." The observation cast a new light on the assembled company. Who among them would have had such intimate knowledge of Lady Bramley's precise movements during the tea ceremony? The answer, Miss Marple reflected, was probably all of them. The Thursday at homes had been a fixture at Bramley Court for years, and Lady Bramley's habits were as predictable as the chiming of the grandfather clock in the hall. Mrs. Brigg, who had been listening to this technical discussion with growing alarm, suddenly spoke up. "But miss, if what you're saying is true, then someone deliberately planned to kill her lady. That's not right. That's not right at all. I'm afraid murder is never right, Mrs. Brigg," Miss Marple said softly. "But yes, this was most certainly planned. The electrical modifications, the wet runner, the careful positioning, none of these things happened by accident." Miss Lydia Martin, who had remained silent throughout most of the proceedings, finally spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "But why would anyone want to hurt Lady Augusta? She was always so kind, so generous." The question of motive hung in the air like an accusation. They all knew about the proposed reduction in Miss Martin's annuity, about Adrienne's debts, about the various ways in which Lady Bramley's death might benefit different members of the household. But knowing about possible motives and proving deliberate murder were two very different things. Miss Marple returned to her corner chair and picked up her knitting, her needles clicking softly as she worked. The physical evidence was clear enough. Someone had turned Lady Bramley's own domestic routine into an instrument of death. The challenge now was to determine which of the seemingly respectable people in this room possessed both the technical knowledge and the cold-blooded determination necessary to carry out such a plan. Outside, the rain continued its relentless assault on the windows, but inside the morning room, a different sort of storm was gathering. The gray afternoon had given way to an early evening that seemed to press against the windows of Bramley Court with an almost malevolent persistence. Inspector Slack had reluctantly agreed that a more thorough examination of the house's electrical systems might prove necessary, and so it was that Miss Marple found herself, somewhat unusually for a lady of her years and station, contemplating a visit to the cellar. "I do hope you won't find this too arduous, Miss Marple," Dr. Haydock said with genuine concern, as they prepared to descend the narrow stone steps. "Perhaps it would be better if Inspector Slack and I handled this portion of the investigation." Miss Marple smiled gently. "How kind of you, Doctor. But I find that one often discovers the most interesting details in the most unlikely places. Besides, I have always found cellars rather fascinating. They tell such stories about the people who live above them." The cellar of Bramley Court was typical of houses of its age and standing. a maze of small rooms and corridors that had served various domestic purposes over the decades. James led the way with a lantern, followed by Mrs. Brigg, who clearly felt that any investigation of her domain required her personal supervision. "The fuse board is just along here," James explained, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. It was installed when the house was first electrified back in 1905. The electrical panel, when they reached it, was indeed a relic of earlier times. A collection of porcelain carriers and brass fittings that spoke of an age when electricity was still something of a novelty. Miss Marple examined it with the same careful attention she had given to the tea table upstairs. "How very interesting," she murmured, peering at one particular fuse carrier. "This wire appears to be quite new." Dr. Haydock leaned closer with his magnifying glass. "You're absolutely right. This is definitely 15-amp wire, and it's been installed very recently. The brass connections are still bright where it was attached." Inspector Slack consulted his notebook. "This would be the morning room circuit, according to the label here." Miss Marple read the pencil notation beneath the carrier. "Morning room sockets, 5A." The discrepancy between the label and the actual wire was glaring once one knew what to look for, Mrs. Brigg, she said gently. "When did you install this heavier wire?" The housekeeper shifted uncomfortably. "This morning, miss, just after breakfast. I was that tired of having to replace the 5-amp wire every few days." "And did anyone observe you making this change?" "Well, James helped me turn off the main switch naturally, and Mr. Adrian happened to be down here at the time. Something about checking the wireless aerial connection, he said." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And where did you purchase the wire?" "From Wren's Ironmongers on the High Street, miss. They're very reliable for electrical supplies." Inspector Slack was beginning to see the implications. So both James and Adrian Bramley knew about the heavier fuse wire before the tea service this afternoon. "That's right, sir," Mrs. Brigg confirmed. "Though I must say Mr. Adrian seemed particularly interested, asked several questions about the amperage and such technical matters." Miss Marple had been exploring the cellar with her lantern, and now she called softly from a corner near the coal bins. "Inspector, might you look at this? I believe we may have found something rather significant." In a dusty corner, partially concealed beneath some old sacking, she had discovered a crumpled envelope. Dr. Haydock examined it carefully in the lamplight. "It's from Wren's Ironmongers," he announced. "Dated this morning. The contents appear to be, yes, fuse wire, 15-amp rating." "But I have my receipt right here," Mrs. Brigg protested, producing a neatly folded paper from her apron pocket. "I certainly didn't throw anything away down here." Miss Marple studied the crumpled envelope more closely. "I think, Mrs. Brigg, that this represents a second purchase. Someone else visited Wren's today and bought additional fuse wire." This revelation sent a chill through the small group. It suggested that the electrical sabotage had been planned in advance, with someone taking care to obtain the necessary materials, independently of Mrs. Brigg's well-intentioned but dangerous modification. "We should speak to Mr. Wren, Inspector," Slack declared. "Find out who else bought fuse wire today." "An excellent idea," Miss Marple agreed, "though I suspect it may be rather late to disturb the shopkeeper this evening." Dr. Haydock consulted his pocket watch. "Actually, it's not yet 7. Wren usually stays open until 7 on Thursdays for the convenience of working people." And so it was that the small investigative party found themselves making their way through the wet streets of St. Mary Mead to the High Street, where Wren's Ironmongers displayed its modest collection of electrical supplies and household goods in a window that had remained substantially unchanged since the reign of Queen Victoria. Mr. Wren himself, a thin, precise man with the sort of memory for detail that made him invaluable to his customers, received them with obvious curiosity. When Inspector Slack explained the nature of their inquiry, his expression grew grave. 15-amp fuse wire, you say? Yes, indeed, I sold some this morning. Mrs. Brigg from Bramley Court was my first customer. She's always very punctual about her shopping. And were there any other customers for the same item? Miss Marple asked gently. Mr. Wren nodded slowly. As a matter of fact, yes. Most unusual, really, to have two requests for the same rather specialized item in one day. The second customer came in around 11. And who was that? Inspector Slack demanded with barely concealed impatience. Well, it was Miss Martin from Bramley Court. Lady Bramley's companion, you know. She seemed quite particular about getting exactly the right gauge of wire. The silence that followed this revelation was profound. Miss Marple felt a familiar stirring, of interest mixed with sadness. In her long experience, the revelation of guilt often brought with it a sense of tragedy that no amount of justice could entirely dispel. Did Miss Martin purchase anything else? She asked quietly. Mr. Wren consulted his daybook. Let me see. Yes, she bought a small screwdriver and a card of black mending thread. Said she needed them for some domestic repairs. Dr. Haydock and Inspector Slack exchanged meaningful glances. The black thread would explain the left-handed knots they had, found in the sabotage plug, while the screwdriver would have been necessary for removing and replacing the socket faceplate. Did she seem at all unusual in her manner? Miss Marple inquired. Well, now that you mention it, she did seem rather nervous, kept glancing about as though she was afraid of being observed. I thought it odd at the time, but one doesn't like to pry into customers' private affairs. As they made their way back to Bramley Court through the wet evening, Miss Marple reflected on the mounting evidence against Miss Lydia Martin, the purchase of electrical supplies, the technical knowledge implied by the careful sabotage, the left-handed knots, and most tellingly, the powerful motive provided by the proposed reduction in her annuity. Yet something troubled her about the case. In her experience, guilty parties often betrayed themselves through small inconsistencies or nervous behaviors. Miss Martin had certainly appeared distressed. But was it the distress of guilt or genuine grief for her employer's death? The answer, Miss Marple suspected, would require one more careful examination of the physical evidence before the truth could be established beyond reasonable doubt. The return to Bramley Court found the remaining members of the household in a state of barely suppressed tension. Word of the visit to Wren's ironmongers had somehow preceded them, as such news inevitably does in small communities, and Miss Marple observed that Miss Lydia Martin had grown even paler than before, if such a thing were possible. The evening had brought with it a chill that seemed to penetrate the very stones of the old house, and Mrs. Brigg directed James to build up the fires in both the morning room and the drawing room. The domestic routines continued with their customary precision, but there was an undercurrent of unease that no amount of normal activity could entirely dispel. Miss Marple had requested permission to examine Mrs. Brigg's private sitting room, a small but comfortable chamber that served as the housekeeper's domain and refuge. I do hope you won't think me presumptuous, Mrs. Brigg, she said gently as they entered the neat, well-ordered room. But I believe your experiences with the tea urn during the servants' meal may prove most illuminating. Mrs. Brigg looked puzzled, but cooperative. I'm sure I don't know what you mean, miss. Everything went quite normally at the servants' tea, except for the fuse popping, of course. Miss Marple examined the room with her characteristic attention to detail. Everything was in its proper place, from the carefully arranged photographs on the mantelpiece to the work-basket that sat beside Mrs. Brigg's favorite chair. It was toward this basket that her attention was drawn. Might I examine your work-basket, Mrs. Brigg? I have always found that a woman sewing tells such interesting stories about her daily life. The housekeeper looked surprised, but nodded her consent. Of course, miss, and though I can't imagine what you hope to find there, just the usual mending, and such. Miss Marple lifted the lid of the wicker basket and began to examine its contents with the practiced eye of one who had spent decades managing similar domestic arrangements. Spools of thread in various colors, a pincushion bristling, with needles, a small pair of scissors, and tucked beneath a folded tea towel, something that made her pause. "How interesting," she murmured, lifting out what appeared to be a linen doily. The fabric bore a distinctive round brown mark, roughly the size of a teacup that had clearly been caused by heat. "Oh, that old thing," Mrs. Briggs said dismissively. "I was going to throw it away. Got scorched when I put it under the urn during the servants' tea. The table in the pantry isn't as level as the one in the morning room, and I thought it best to protect the surface." Miss Marple examined the scorch mark more closely. "And when did this scorching occur?" "Just as I was setting up for the staff tea, miss. The moment I plugged in the urn, there was a little spark from the pantry socket, and I noticed the doily had got singed. I replaced it immediately, of course." Dr. Haydock, who had been listening to this exchange with growing interest, stepped forward. "Miss Marple," she said, passing it to him, noting as she did so a small dark stain on the hemmed edge. "Mrs. Briggs, this mark here, might I ask what it is?" The housekeeper examined the indicated spot. "Oh, that's just a bit of boot polish, miss. James had been cleaning his pantry shoes this morning, and there was a spot of black on the table where I set the doily down." Miss Marple found this explanation both plausible and potentially significant. "And James's shoes, would they be the ones he wears when serving in the pantry?" "Yes, miss. He keeps a separate pair for pantry work on account of the stone floors being rather damp. Very particular about such things as James." Dr. Haydock had been examining the scorch mark on the doily with his magnifying glass. "This burn pattern is quite fresh," he observed, "and it's consistent with electrical arcing. This doily was definitely singed by the same sort of electrical fault that killed Lady Bramley." The implications of this discovery were becoming clear. The urn had been dangerous during the servants' meal as well, which meant that the electrical sabotage had been in place from the very beginning of the afternoon's events. Miss Marple continued her examination of the workbasket, and presently made another discovery that caused her to pause thoughtfully. Tucked beneath a half-finished piece of embroidery was an empty card that had once held black mending thread. "Mrs. Briggs," she said gently, "this thread card. Might I ask when you used the last of this particular thread?" The housekeeper looked confused. "Why, I haven't used any black thread recently, miss. That card's been empty for weeks. I meant to throw it away, but somehow never got around to it." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully and continued her search. Presently, her careful fingers encountered something else of interest. A small scrap of black rubber tape with what appeared to be green paint adhered to one surface. "And this?" she inquired, holding up the tape fragment. "What about this?" Mrs. Briggs examined it with evident puzzlement. "I've never seen that before, miss. It's certainly not mine." Dr. Haydock took the tape and examined it closely. "The green paint appears to match the color of the electrical socket faceplates in this house. This looks like insulating tape that might have been used to cover exposed wires." Inspector Slack, who had been following these discoveries with growing excitement, suddenly spoke up. "So someone used Mrs. Briggs' workbasket to hide evidence of their electrical tampering?" "It would appear so," Miss Marple replied quietly, "though I suspect the person in question may not have realized they were leaving such clear traces of their activities." The mounting physical evidence was painting an increasingly clear picture of premeditation and careful planning. Someone had not only sabotaged the electrical connection of the urn, but had also taken care to dispose of the materials used in the process. Miss Marple reflected on the significance of the empty thread card. Someone had used the last of Mrs. Briggs' black thread for the left-handed knots in the sabotaged plug, then carelessly returned the empty card to the work basket. It was the sort of small oversight that often proved crucial in cases such as these. "Mrs. Brigg," she said thoughtfully, "who has access to your sitting room? Do any of the other household members come here regularly?" The housekeeper considered this carefully. "Well, miss, I don't encourage casual visits, but Miss Martin does sometimes join me for a cup of tea in the evenings. We often work on our mending together. She's very handy with a needle." "Is Miss Martin left-handed in her needlework?" The revelation hung in the air like an accusation. Miss Marple felt the familiar sadness that came with the approaching resolution of a case. The evidence was becoming overwhelming, yet she found herself hoping against hope that some alternative explanation might present itself. "Tell me, Mrs. Brigg," she continued gently, "is Miss Martin left-handed in her needlework?" "Why, yes, miss, she is. Always has been ever since she came to work for Lady Bramley. Very neat and precise in her stitching, though she does tie her knots in that peculiar left-handed way." As they prepared to return to the morning room, Miss Marple found herself contemplating the tragic inevitability that seemed to be unfolding. The physical evidence was clear, the motive was established, and the opportunity had certainly existed. Yet something in Miss Martin's manner continued to trouble her, a quality of genuine distress that seemed inconsistent with the calculated nature of the crime they were investigating. The evening had settled fully over Bramley Court by the time the small investigative party returned to the morning room, where the remaining members of the household waited with varying degrees of apprehension. The fire had been built up against the autumn chill, casting dancing shadows on the walls that seemed to emphasize the gravity of the situation that had folded. Inspector Slack had assumed an air of official importance that suggested he felt the case was nearing its conclusion. He positioned himself importantly near the fireplace and consulted his notebook, with the sort of theatrical gravity that Miss Marple had observed in many amateur investigators over the years. "Now then," he announced, "I think it's time we had some straight answers about what happened here this afternoon. Adrian Bramley, I want to hear exactly what you did when you helped James with that plug." Adrian, who had been standing near the window with the expression of a man who wished himself anywhere else, turned with obvious reluctance. His usual air of casual confidence had been replaced by something approaching panic. "Look here, Inspector," he began, his voice taking on a defensive tone. "I've already explained that I simply rewired the plug when the pantry fuse gave trouble. It's the sort of thing I do all the time with my wireless equipment." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting, with mild interest. "Oh yes, your wireless hobby. I do find such technical pursuits fascinating. Might I ask how you typically secure your electrical connections?" Adrian looked puzzled by the question. "Well, I use proper electrical tape, naturally, and I always label my plugs so I know which apparatus they belong to. Organization is terribly important when you're working with multiple wireless sets." "How very methodical of you," Miss Marple observed. "And when you make repairs, do you always use tape rather than thread or string?" "Good heavens, yes. Thread would be completely inappropriate for electrical work. One must use proper insulating materials." Dr. Haydock had been listening to this exchange with growing interest. "Mr. Bramley, when you tie knots in your electrical work, which hand do you favor?" Adrian demonstrated unconsciously, making a small tying motion with his hands. "Right hand, naturally. Always have done." Miss Marple noted this with satisfaction. The demonstration clearly showed a right-handed bow tie, quite different from the left-handed knots they had found in the sabotage plug. Inspector Slack, meanwhile, had been examining some items that had been retrieved from Adrian's room during their absence. "What about these then?" he demanded, holding up a collection of electrical components, valves, resistors, insulating, tape. "Seems like you've got everything needed for electrical sabotage right here." "Those are wireless components," Adrian protested. "Perfectly legitimate equipment for radio experimentation. I've been working on a crystal set that can receive broadcasts from London." Miss Marple examined the items with interest. How very neat and well organized everything is. Each component labeled and carefully arranged. "You obviously take great pride in your workmanship." "Well, naturally. Precision is essential in wireless work. One loose connection can ruin an entire circuit. And yet," Miss Marple continued thoughtfully, "the work we found in the urn plug was quite different in character. Thread ties instead of proper tape, unlabeled connections, rather slapdash workmanship. Overall, not at all the sort of thing one would expect from someone with your obvious expertise." This observation seemed to strike Adrian forcibly. "That's quite right. I would never do such botched work. My reputation as a wireless enthusiast would be ruined if word got about that I tied connections with thread like some sort of amateur." James, who had been standing silently near the door, cleared his throat respectfully. "If I might say so, sir, Mr. Adrian's electrical work is always very professional. He's helped us with various household problems over the years, and everything is always properly done with the correct materials." Miss Marple had been observing another aspect of the room during these exchanges. "Inspector Slack," she said gently, "might I direct your attention to the position of the hearthrug?" The inspector looked down at the rug beneath his feet, with obvious puzzlement. "What about it?" "Well, you see, it's not quite where it should be. James, when you arranged this room for the at-home, was the rug positioned exactly as it is now?" The butler examined the rug's position with the trained eye of someone responsible for maintaining household order. "Why, no, miss, I don't believe it was. It seems to have been moved several inches toward the radiator." Miss Marple knelt beside the rug, her keen eyes noting the faint dust shadow on the polished floor that revealed the rug's original position. 3 inches, I should say. Just enough to bring someone standing by the tea urn that much closer to the earthed radiator valve. Dr. Haydock immediately grasped the significance. Reducing the distance between the electrical source and the earth connection would make the shock more certain and more severe. "But who would have moved it?" Inspector Slack demanded. "And when?" Mrs. Brigg, who had been following these proceedings, with growing alarm, suddenly spoke up. "I never moved any rugs, I can tell you that. Everything was left exactly as it should be for her ladyship's at home." Miss Marple had turned her attention to Miss Lydia Martin, who sat rigidly in her chair, with her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The pale woman had grown progressively more distressed as the evening's discoveries had mounted, and now she seemed almost to be shrinking into herself. "Miss Martin," Miss Marple said very gently, "I've noticed that you often work with your hands. During these social gatherings. Embroidery, I believe." Lydia nodded wordlessly, her eyes fixed on her lap. "And when you sew, you have the habit of preparing your thread in a particular way. I've observed you doing so on several occasions." I lick the thread to point it," Lydia whispered. "It makes it easier to thread the needle. And you tie your knots in the left-handed fashion. It's quite distinctive once one knows what to look for." Miss Martin's composure finally cracked. "Yes," she said so quietly that the others had to strain to hear her. "I've always tied knots that way. Lady Augusta used to tease me about it. Said it was like watching someone write backwards." The admission hung in the air like a confession, though Miss Marple noted that it was not quite that. Not yet. Inspector Slack was preparing to make what appeared to be an arrest when Miss Marple held up a gentle hand. "If I might suggest, Inspector, there are still one or two points that require clarification. I believe Mrs. Brigg may have something more to tell us about the fuse box situation." The housekeeper looked startled. "I've told you everything, miss, about buying the heavier wire to stop the nuisance of constant fuse changing." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, "and I believe that purchase, made with the best of intentions, actually enabled this crime to succeed. But I think we need to understand exactly how the timing worked out. The electrical trap required not just the sabotage plug, but also the overfused circuit to prevent any protective blowing of fuses." As she spoke, Miss Marple found herself thinking about the careful choreography that had been required to transform Lady Bramley's familiar tea ceremony into an instrument of death. Someone had planned this crime with meticulous attention to detail, taking advantage of household routines and predictable human behavior. The question that remained was whether that someone was the pale, distressed woman who sat before them, or whether they were dealing with a more complex situation entirely. The drawing room at Bramley Court had never witnessed such a gathering as assembled there on that gray Thursday evening. The various members of the household and Lady Bramley's guests sat in chairs arranged in a rough semicircle, facing Miss Marple, who had positioned herself near the fireplace with her knitting bag at her feet. The atmosphere was heavy with expectation and dread. Inspector Slack stood importantly beside the mantelpiece, his notebook at the ready, while Dr. Haydock had taken a seat where he could observe all the assembled faces. Mr. Simmons clutched his briefcase as though it might provide some protection against the revelations to come, and Lady Bantry looked as though she regretted ever leaving the safety of her own drawing room. "Ladies and gentlemen," Miss Marple began in her gentle voice, "I'm afraid we're gathered here this evening to discuss a most carefully planned and executed murder. Someone in this room transformed Lady Bramley's own beloved ritual of afternoon tea into an instrument of death." She paused, allowing her mild blue eyes to rest briefly on each face before continuing. The method was both ingenious and diabolical. The murderer turned the antique silver urn into what Dr. Haydock has correctly identified as a lethal electrical trap. Dr. Haydock nodded grimly. The technical aspects were quite sophisticated. Someone with considerable knowledge disabled the earth connection, reversed the electrical polarity, and ensured that the protective fuse would not blow by taking advantage of Mrs. Briggs' well-intentioned modification to the fuse box. "Indeed," Miss Marple continued, "the wet lace runner beneath the urn created a broad conductor connecting the electrified silver to the gallery tray. The murderer knew Lady Bramley's habits intimately, how she always stood just so, right hand on the tap, left hand seeking the radiator valve for balance. When she touched both the electrified tap and the earthed radiator valve simultaneously, the current found its deadly path. Mrs. Clement had gone quite pale, but surely such a plan could never be certain to work. On the contrary, Miss Marple replied sadly, Lady Bramley was a creature of the most precise habits. For 15 years I watched her perform the same ritual, in exactly the same way. The murderer could count on her movements as surely as one might count on the chiming of a clock. Inspector Slack cleared his throat importantly. The evidence all points to Miss Martin here. She bought the electrical supplies. She had access to the sewing materials used in the sabotage. She ties left-handed knots, and she had the strongest motive with that annuity business. Miss Lydia Martin sat rigid in her chair, her face a mask of despair. I never meant, she began, then fell silent. But Miss Marple held up a gentle hand. I'm afraid, Inspector, that while Miss Martin may indeed be guilty of something, she is not guilty of murder. The statement sent a ripple of surprise through the assembled company. "You see," Miss Marple continued, "while the evidence against Miss Martin appears overwhelming, there are several details that trouble me greatly. Most significantly, the timing of events does not support her guilt." She moved to stand beside the tea table, which had been left largely undisturbed since the tragic events of the afternoon. Miss Martin learned of the proposed reduction to her annuity only this afternoon, when Mr. Simmons mentioned the document he had brought for Lady Bramley to sign. Yet the electrical sabotage was clearly planned well in advance. The fuse wire had to be purchased, the plug had to be modified, and most tellingly, the trap had to be tested. Tested? Dr. Haydock looked up sharply. "Oh, yes," Miss Marple said with certainty. Mrs. Brigg found a scorched doily in her work basket, evidence that the electrical fault had manifested during the servants' tea. The housemaid reported feeling a tingle from the urn at that time. This was not accidental. It was a deliberate test to ensure the trap would work when required. She turned to face the assembled group, but Miss Martin was not present during the servants' tea at 2:45. She was in the village at that time, as several witnesses can attest. She could not have conducted this crucial test. Inspector Slack looked confused. But if not Miss Martin, then who? Miss Marple's expression grew infinitely sad. "I'm afraid the true murderer is someone who had both the technical knowledge and the intimate access necessary to carry out such a plan. Someone who was present during both the servants' tea and the fatal at home. Someone who had every opportunity to make the necessary preparations." Her eyes came to rest on Mrs. Brigg, who had gone very still. "Mrs. Brigg," Miss Marple said gently, "I believe you purchased that fuse wire not to solve a household nuisance, but to enable a murder you had already planned." The housekeeper's composure cracked like ice. "That's impossible. I've served this family faithfully for 20 years, and that service is precisely what makes this so tragic," Miss Marple replied. "You knew Lady Bramley intended to close the house, to pension off most of the staff. At your age, finding another position would be nearly impossible. The prospect of destitution drove you to desperate measures." Mrs. Brigg's face had gone ashen. "You can't prove any of this." "I'm afraid I can," Miss Marple said sadly. "You see, you made several small mistakes. The boot polish on the scorched doily came from James's pantry shoes, but James told us his shoes hadn't been polished recently. The polish was fresh. You used the doily to protect the pantry table during your test, and it picked up polish from work you had been doing that very morning." She paused, then continued with inexorable logic. "More significantly, you deliberately implicated Miss Martin by planting evidence in her work basket. The empty thread card, the rubber tape with green paint. But you overlooked one crucial detail. Miss Martin is left-handed in her needlework, but she writes with her right hand. The purchase receipt from Wren's, however, shows handwriting that matches your own household accounts." Dr. Haydock was staring at Mrs. Brigg with dawning comprehension. "You forged Miss Martin's signature at the shop." Mrs. Brigg's shoulders sagged in defeat. "She would have been provided for," she whispered. "Lady Bramley would never have let Miss Martin starve. But me. 20 years of faithful service, and I would have been turned out with nothing but a character reference." "So you used Miss Martin's known financial worries as a cover for your own crime," Miss Marple observed. "You even moved the hearthrug to ensure the electrical contact would be fatal, then shifted the lace runner afterward to hide the scorch mark." The confession, when it came, was almost anticlimactic. Mrs. Brigg broke down completely, admitting to the careful planning, the electrical sabotage, and the deliberate framing of Miss Martin. "I only meant to give her a fright at first," she sobbed, "to make her reconsider the dismissals. But when I learned about the annuity reduction, I saw a chance to solve all my problems at once. As Inspector Slack placed Mrs. Brigg under arrest, Miss Marple felt the familiar mixture of satisfaction and sadness that came with the resolution of such cases. Justice would be served, but at what a terrible cost. Miss Lydia Martin, freed from suspicion but devastated by the day's events, sat quietly as the various officials made their arrangements. Lady Bramley's last at home had indeed been her final, but not in the way anyone could have anticipated. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, but inside Bramley Court, the shadows seemed to linger still. Miss Marple packed away her knitting with a gentle sigh, reflecting that even the most civilized of rituals could be corrupted by desperate human hearts. "Poison is only one way to kill at tea," she murmured to herself as she prepared to leave. "Habit and a little dampness can do the rest."